today with John Harbison, principal guest conductor of Emmanuel Music, Pulitzer Prize-winning composer, and longtime friend to Emmanuel Music, as well as what I would consider a mentor. John, it's great to see you, and how are you coping during this time of isolation?
I think okay. It's very new and different every day.
It is. You know,
Mhm.
the role of a conductor and a composer is somewhat one of solitude, but this might take it a little too far.
Yeah, I think so. I miss the outdoor part of life a lot.
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah. Hi.
Hi. All right. Thank you. Our little conductor, Caroline.
She's conducting. Beautiful.
So the cantata today that we're discussing, Wer Gott nicht mit uns diese Zeit, Cantata 14, a rather late submission, I guess you would say, to his chorale cantata year, almost 10 years after the fact, given that the fourth Sunday after Epiphany did not occur in 1725 because of how early Easter happened to be. So I have always seen this cantata as one that has one foot in the past and one in the future. The way Bach uses this modal chorale tune from the 16th century combined with a sort of contemporary chromaticism that leads into the second movement, which is this sort of almost Mozartian approach in the soprano aria. I wonder if you agree with that premise, and why do you think he chose this type of musical vocabulary to communicate the text?
The set of fill-in cantatas that you just talked about, the holes in the full church calendar, which clearly began to bother Bach about 10 years, as you said, 10 years after he'd finished the main work on the cycle. And he systematically then filled the holes. These pieces are all different from the main 2 years of the cycle and the cantatas that he'd already accumulated before he got to Leipzig. They're really all different. And I would say the one thing unites virtually the bulk of them. They're weighty, compositionally very ambitious. You know, we think about 177, the completion of 80, 140, which is certainly a big effort, 14, and of course 9, which I've always considered one of the most significant, both theologically and compositionally, of all the Bach cantatas. They're all different in they engage with very serious compositional issues. And the way I felt is just as you've suggested, is that it's the moment he turns his major attention to big evening length work or art of the fugue. It's another mentality, compositional mentality that he's bringing to these pieces, so that the almost kind of unrelenting kind of density of some of these pieces, which I really feel about 14, that even that soprano movement continues to be highly articulated and full in texture. And of course, when you expect to get a little relief in the bass area from the kind of sort of heavy going on, no, it's a big triple, it's a fugue, the three voices. And it just churns along like manically, really. So it is a different world. I think of these, all the add-in pieces seem to me to carry a lot of extra weight and significance.
Now, this cantata, the gospel reading for the day is a gospel from Matthew, where Christ is on a boat with his disciples, and he's fallen asleep, and there's a big storm, and they come and they wake him up and say, save us, save us. And he stills the storm, stills the waves. It's curious to me that it's only really directly referenced in the third movement, which is the tenor recitative. And I wonder, do you think Bach's congregation would have caught this reference? And do you hear other places in the cantata where Bach uses sort of water or storm sound imagery to remind us of the gospel reading?
Well, there's not as much explicit water and sailing and ship aboard metaphorical goings on here as, say, Cantata 93, where he deals with this subject in a much more graphic way. I think what Bach takes the gospel to mean here is assault and difficulty, so that the sense of each movement is that you're in the grip of some problem. The experience of the chorus is being in just such an engagement with complexity and density and hard going that really the tone of the piece is set right in that opening movement, which is really, as you've of course noticed, we don't have any other Bach chorus that's so rigorous. So it's a big instrumental exploration of inversional counterpoint, which really never lets up through the whole piece. You always have someone singing this big subject upside down or right side up. And it's as if the texture never really has those moments where you get a little, a passage of relaxation and clarification. So I think he's taking that sea voyage to be kind of a last moment for the disciples of being buffeted around and eventually, hopefully, rescued.
That's interesting, because I do think in this first movement, you mentioned the art of fugue, and I really think the counterpoint in this, with all the inversions and the fact that he treats all four vocal parts equally, and then with the addition of what's happening in the continuo line and the trumpet and oboe playing the chorale tune, it's almost like it's six-voice counterpoint, and it's of the highest order, and everything is turned upside down and sideways. And I think again of the art of fugue, but there is this sense of the difficulty and the unsettling nature of the storm, where, as you say, some sort of assault on life where we're asking for God's protection, not unlike today's times.
Yeah, and when you are in the midst of the piece, you hear this subject going on, an inversion, then the tune comes in, the chorale tune comes in, and it seems to be going twice as slow, which I guess it is going twice as slow, and that is also an element, I think, of deep surprise and unrest. It's like, wait a minute, one more element to deal with here.
Of course.
Yeah.
The soprano aria is such a startling contrast after the opening chorus. And of course, on our modern instruments that we use at Emmanuel, it's hard to sort of truly replicate the sound that Bach would have encountered with the unvalved instruments. So when our modern trumpet plays this aria, I've always found it to be almost too easy, too sophisticated, too nuanced for the heroic sort of battle within the storm that one might have heard with the corno playing at the top of its range.
Well, I think I've always thought Bach thinks of, and the trumpet, as heroic instruments in that piece, that they are going to sound in his mind somewhat similar, and that they will both be extremely assertive, extremely brass. And I know that this was a favorite piece, one of the few cantatas that the Bach area group ever performed. They never performed cantatas much, but they were always doing arias. But William Scheide loved this piece, and he used to assign Eileen Farrell to the soprano part. Now, if you've ever heard Eileen Farrell, that's a trumpet and a half.
Yes, gave the horn a run for its money.
Yeah, actually, the trumpet sounded a little bit too tame. But in fact, I think what he was hearing there, I think it is there in the character. There is something very grand about both solo instruments in that piece still, and as you said, it keeps up the energy of the cantata. It just changes the energy, modifies it, but it's still there. There's still a sense that this piece is busy and hopped up and kind of invigorated all the way through. And that piece has a lot of notes in it, that soprano piece. I mean,
indeed,
it doesn't let up on the density very much.
It's rather insistent. You mentioned earlier the bass aria and how it's essentially a 3 and sometimes 4 voice contrapuntal texture. And the opening motive in the oboe ritornello is based on the first 3 notes of the chorale tune. And I've always wondered this. Do you think Bach's congregation would have picked up on that? Or was it some way he was subliminally getting under the listener's skin? Or what do you make of that 3-note motive that keeps reappearing?
The only thing I think we'd probably be sure of is that Bach meant it and felt it. As for the congregation, I think the effect of the piece is much more about how, without respite that tune is in the bass area.
Mm.
It just zooms along, and it's the steady kind of very articulated eighth notes that go on and on and on. You want a breath in that piece, and everybody's looking for a breath, and the lines just don't have it. Neither the accompaniment nor the bass. It's as if they are both driven to continue, and I think that's it's the world of this piece. It really is lots of insistent ongoing. We've got to persist. We've got to keep going, even though we're just bouncing around here, kind of haplessly.
We get to the final chorale, and I'm reminded that it was only a few weeks earlier that the first performance of the Christmas Oratorio was heard. Mm. And when I think of the chorales in the Christmas Oratorio, there's the inner voices, the bass line, there's a lot of activity, more so than we would hear perhaps in the Passions. And this final chorale is no exception. There's syncopations and suspensions in the inner voices, and there's an animated bass line. And all of these things to me work against what is a somewhat hopeful text. I mean, there's even, I believe, a line in there about, what is it? The trap is broken, we are free, our soul is delivered. And yet there's still the tension in the chorale tune. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I've thought about that. Right. You know, this back in the days when I was trying to sell the idea that these pieces would be, that Bach cantatas would be useful in translation, which was very unpopular, as you remember, at Emmanuel Church. I thought this would be a good test for that premise, because, you know, it was such a difficult piece for the listener. And I thought maybe if we could hear the words more, it really helps as little there as it does anywhere, because he doesn't pay much attention in that marvelous harmonization with releasing the tension or trying to mirror, as you say, the change of tone of the words. He goes really with the chromaticism of the chorale tune. And you feel that sort of influencing all the voices and all the voice leading. Very, as you say, it's a very Christmas oratorio era, beautifully elaborated chorale, where he is, I think he's more loyal to the premises of his piece than he is to that moment. You know, that he's written a whole piece with this sense of really reacting to this threatened quality of this world that these people are living in, that, you know, how are we going to survive this? And the chorale really is responding more to that than to that what's really one line of the text which says, well, you know, we seem to be getting out of trouble here. Folks. Yeah.
Yeah, there is a little sense of false hope in a way.
Right. Yeah, right.
And it's like Bach's reminding us, you know, you're not out of the woods yet. You got a long way to go.
Yeah,
even though
indeed.
the text says you might be, you aren't. I remember that Cantata 14 in English. I remember singing it with you.
Yeah.
And singing the tenor recit and remembering the soprano aria, our resistance is too weak to withstand the great tormentor.
That's right. Well, yes. You know, it was an effort. It was an effort to make a piece like this, which I think is probably fairly doomed, but nevertheless, to make a piece like this more apprehendable to an audience that's always found it difficult. I remember Scheide's report whenever he performed that piece is, our Bach cantata is always so stern. Well, the answer is no. The short answer. But it is true that it's a dose. It's a very unusual dose, and it is coming from a world of highly driven compositional investigation, which, as you know, we've been talking about that sort of carryover from the other work that's on his table. And we know that he's turned so much to pieces where the abstract meaning of his ideas is very, very real and important to him. And he seems to have not slackened that thought process much in this cantata. He just sort of, he's very passionate about seeing the ideas, the musical ideas, musical thinking through.
Indeed. Another example of Bach working against the text, as he often does, and challenging his listener to find what is the deeper meaning. And I can only, in closing, think about this idea of the boat on the ocean in a storm, and that perhaps he got us through one little mini storm, but there's another one coming. And that's why Bach doesn't want to resolve this.
And also maybe in the large picture, we can think about Cantata 93, which he's already written, which is, there's much more rescue in that piece for the listener. The listener does escape much more into a world of hope and calm. And that's not what happens in Cantata 14.
Sure doesn't. Well, John, I thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. And I hope that we're back together making music in person sometime soon rather than just talking about it.
Thanks, Ryan. We all hope so. Thank you.